As the title of this video rightly says, the facts of the case took place in a municipality of Valencia called Alcasser. Its population, which barely exceeds 10,000 inhabitants, was characterized by being very peaceful. Before this case, years had passed without a serious crime occurring. Normally, the little that happened there were disputes between neighbors or some other problem of very little importance. At least also if we compare it to what happened on this occasion. It is for this very reason that Alcácer was relatively quiet that it was even more surprising when this case occurred. The victims of this story are Antonia, Desiree, and Miriam, 3 teenagers who were brutally murdered. The oldest of the 3 was Antonia Gomez Rodriguez, born on May 25, 1977 in Ciudad Sanitaria de la Fe, also in Valencia. At the time of the events, Antonia was 15 years old, a year older than her friends, in fact, who called her Tony. The youngest of 4 siblings, Antonia had dropped out of high school. Studying was not her thing, and she was eagerly waiting to turn 16 so she could start working. Those who had known the group of friends together claimed that Tony was the most shy and reserved of the 3. But she also had a very sweet and tender personality, with a smile that made her stand out among everyone. In age, the one who followed her was Maria Deseada Hernandez Folch, who everyone knew as Desire. She was born on February 7, 1978, and therefore, at the time of the events, she was 14 years old. Passionate about sports and especially about skating, Desiree was undoubtedly the most popular of the 3, known for skating all over the town. This girl had a most charming personality, and that helped her to make friends with practically anyone she talked to. Unlike Tony, Desiree was still in high school, but the truth is she wasn't doing well at all. The only subject she managed to get good grades in was sports, something she really loved. The group was completed by Miriam Garcia Iborra, who was also 14 years old and was, without a doubt, the shyest of the group. Although her parents, Doctors Fernando Garcia Mediano and Matilde Iborra Martinez, described her as a very sensitive and sweet girl. Like her friends, Miriam wasn't doing too well in her studies, but she also didn't like sports. In fact, she was more attracted to the arts and specifically dance. Ever since she was a little girl, Miriam dreamed of being a ballet dancer, but it seemed she wasn't very good at it, no matter how much she tried. Even though clearly no matter how much they all weren't doing well at that instant, at that moment in their lives, they still had a lot of time to figure out what they wanted to do and how to do it. Or at least, that's what should have happened. They should have had time to explore all these things, but that wasn't the case. They were 3 teenage girls who really didn't get into any trouble, who didn't have problems with anyone, and who were really finding their way in life. There was no hint of what was about to happen to them. It is with this context that we can move on to the day of the events. On Friday the 13th of November 1992, the 3 girls went to the house of Esther, another one of their friends. The 4 had arranged a few days in advance to go out dancing, agreeing to meet at Esther's house as a starting point. Antonia, Desiree, and Miriam arrived at Esther's house at 8 in the evening. On Friday, encountering a problem. Esther was sick, she had the flu, and therefore she was not going to be able to go out dancing. Not wanting to leave just like that, the girls stayed with Esther for a while before deciding to go to Color, a nightclub in Picasen, another community in Valencia located north of the city. Still, from Esther's house, around 8 post-meridium, Miriam called her father to find out if he could drive them to the club because at that point they had no one available to take them. It's not that the road was particularly dangerous or particularly far, but it would definitely be better if someone they knew took them. It's also important to understand that just at that time, the people who usually could have taken them were either busy or sick. Because at that time, for some reason, there was a pretty strong flu going around and a lot of people were no longer available. The bowling alley in question was only 2 kilometers away from where they were, but the biggest problem was that the road was dark and a bit isolated. Miriam's mother explained to her daughter that it wasn't going to be possible, that they wouldn't be able to take her since her husband had come back from work with a fever and he had gone straight to bed. Without the possibility of being driven, the girls said goodbye to Esther and decided to hitchhike to get to Route CB 405, enter the streets of Picassine and Montserrat, where Color was located, which was one of the most popular nightclubs among teenagers at that time. And it is that in that place, every Saturday and Sunday there were parties organized by those groups from nearby institutes that were about to graduate. They were those groups that needed to raise funds for the graduation trip, given that it was a party for minors. The disco used to close at 10 o'clock at night, so the girls were somewhat anxious to be able to arrive before it closed, so they did not delay in heading to a busy road to hitchhike. It's important to clarify that at that time it was a completely common practice. I'm not saying it wasn't a bit dangerous. I'm not saying they didn't know it could be dangerous. But it was such a short stretch and it was quite common, so it wasn't a big deal. Above all, it was more common in remote municipalities and towns, like the one where the girls lived. Was it ideal? No, it was not ideal, especially for such an isolated and dark place. But ultimately, it wasn't the first time they had done it. They had already hitchhiked before. As I tell you, it wasn't very strange, so they didn't think about it too much. The problem came when, after saying goodbye to their friend Esther, no one else found them. When after 10 at night, none of the girls returned home, their parents began to worry. They knew that Color closed at 10, and all the previous times they had gone, they returned shortly after that time. It's not that they stayed chatting too much, it's not that they went to someone else's house, they returned. Worried, the parents got in touch with each other. Since none of them had news from their daughters, they decided to go look for them at Color directly. Assuming that perhaps the party had extended and they were still there, at least hoping for the best. However, upon arriving at the nightclub, they found that it was closed. Only a couple of employees were left who were organizing the place and cleaning up after the party. Worried, the parents of one of the girls approached to ask if they had seen their daughter and the other two. But the workers claimed they hadn't even seen them at the nightclub that night. Increasingly worried after that, they filed a report for the disappearance. Initially, the police met with the girls' parents to find out who these teenagers were, how they had gone out, what they were wearing, and if they had taken any money. Their intention was to confirm or rule out the possibility that they had left of their own free will on their own to see if perhaps they had run away in some way. The girls, in fact, had only taken what they were wearing and practically had no money, so they ended up ruling out the possibility that they had chosen to leave. After ruling out this first theory, the hypothesis of a kidnapping began to gain more strength. However, as it was very late at that time, it was decided to start the search first thing in the morning, when daylight could help them. The search took place both in Alcácer and in Picassine. Therefore, the police accepted the help of all those volunteers who wanted to collaborate in some way. And this ended up being really tragic. On Sunday, November 15th, while two civil protection volunteers were searching in the ravines of Picassine and were about to put on their reflective vests, an all-terrain vehicle passing through the area ran them over, causing serious injuries. Fernando Castilla Vela died immediately, and Francisco Conejo Rodriguez survived with lifelong consequences. Beyond this incident, which already made the whole case terribly complicated, none of the searches in both municipalities yielded results. There were practically no clues, but there was a huge amount of testimonies. People who believed they had seen the girls came forward to talk to the authorities. This was not limited only to Alcácer or Picassine, in fact, not even only to Valencia. People from all over Spain contacted the police of their respective communities claiming to have seen them. The calls were so many that it was impossible for the Alcácer police to attend to them without neglecting the investigation. Therefore, 2 special police units were organized in Granada and Pamplona to attend to these calls and collect the clues that the citizens were giving. Thanks to this method, a statement was obtained from a young couple. According to what they said, they had seen the 3 hitchhiking at the exit of Alcasser and decided to approach with their car to take them. They traveled with them to a service station at the entrance of Picason, where their paths diverged, reconstructing the girls' movements. These special units received a call from a teenager a few years older than them who claimed to have seen them. While he was heading back home, they were going in the opposite direction, that is, towards the nightclub. Finally, we have the testimony of an older woman who provided one of the first clues. She said she had seen the 3 girls hitchhiking under the balcony of her house. After a few minutes of seeing them there, a small white car arrived in which you could see that there were 4 people inside. However, the woman did not remember the license plate or the model of the car that the girls supposedly got into. Without any solid clue about what had happened, the police focused their first actions in Picasen. First, they investigated the girls' friends and acquaintances, but they did not obtain any kind of information. So they moved on to investigate the regular customers of color, the employees, and even the owners of the nightclub, without success either. Conversations with those people who had attended the nightclub that Friday led the police to conclude that the girls had never arrived at their destination. That is, whatever happened to them. It happened between this last place, where they were still seen alive, until before arriving at Color. With that conclusion, the police decided to focus on all the inmates of Picasen who had been released days before the girls' disappearance. They also focused on the area's sex offenders, which allowed them to find their first suspect. For 2 weeks, they closely followed the movements of a man who had several complaints for offending decency. More than once, he had been seen satisfying himself with life-size inflatable dolls in an open field in the area, although they ended up dismissing him. Meanwhile, the police kept distributing thousands of posters with information about the 3 girls in all the nearby cities. They also relied on the media, which gave enormous coverage to the case and helped the information and photos of the young girls to be quickly disseminated throughout the country. The national government was involved in the case. The then Minister of the Interior, José Luis Corcuera, was in contact with the girls' parents from the beginning. And later he formed a special team made up of the Civil Guard and the National Police to assist with the search. For his part, President Felipe González met with the families of the young women only on Christmas Eve, that is, more than a month after the disappearance. By that point, there had been no major advances in the investigation. And due to the lack of clues, it was decided to inform Interpol about what was happening, in order to expand the search outside of Spain as well. However, the families of Antonia, Desiree, and Miriam did not stand by idly. Upon learning that the search was extending outside the country, they decided to personally make posters in different languages, which they began to distribute in some countries in Africa and Europe. During the rest of 1992 and until the end of January of the following year, both the police and the girls' parents followed several leads, such as one indicating that they could have been taken to Morocco to be sold as sex slaves. But this lead seemed to be a dead end. The investigation continued over the following months, until finally, on January 27, 1993, a discovery was made that would change everything. 75 days had passed since these young women disappeared, when, after intense rains, the land of the ravine of La Romana, southeast of Valencia, was softened, allowing the 3 bodies that day, around 10 in the morning, to be found by 2 beekeepers in the area. The men were named Gabriel Aquino Gonzalez and Jose Sala. They were 69 and 53 years old, respectively. At the time of the discovery, they were in that area taking care of the beehives when they suddenly noticed a semi-buried human arm wearing a rather large watch on the wrist. Obviously, this was very attention-grabbing. Believing it to be a mannequin, they approached only to discover a grave. They quickly called the authorities and a civil guard team arrived at the scene, but the process of collecting the bodies was quite cumbersome. The judge in charge of the lifting, Jose Miguel Bor, took several hours to arrive at the place, and this led to the fact that they could not unearth the corpses until he was there. At first, and considering the size of the watch that was seen on the surface, the civil guard team thought it was a man. However, upon digging, they were surprised to find that it was a woman, and upon further digging, they discovered that there were 2 other female bodies. Also, the 3 bodies were wrapped in a new and quite large rug. These bodies were bound and stacked on top of each other without touching. 2 of them had their heads separated from the rest of their bodies. Both the bodies and the clothes they were wearing were in an advanced state of decomposition. In fact, the clothes were so deteriorated that the colors of the garments could barely be distinguished. While searching around the pit, the authorities found various objects, such as an unspent 9mm cartridge, a video game, a glove, and several pieces of paper. This last item would be key in identifying the first suspects. The investigators patiently reconstructed using all the paper pieces a flyer from La Fe Hospital in Valencia. The brochure listed the name Enrique Angles Martins. The first thing they did was inquire at this health institution about this man. There it was learned that he had been treated there for syphilis. Immediately, the 3 bodies were transferred to the municipality of Siomai, where the autopsies were to be performed. The rumor that it was about the Alcasser lines had already started to circulate, but the authorities decided not to confirm it until the autopsies were performed. Only at midnight of that same day, they were transferred to the Forensic Anatomical Institute of Valencia for the necessary forensic analysis to be carried out. The civil guard persisted in pursuing the path outlined by the flyer. On the morning of January 28th, a group of civil guard officers showed up at the residence of Enrique Angles in Catarroja. There, the suspect lived with his mother, Nusa Martins, as well as his sister Kelly and her boyfriend. Both he and his sister and brother-in-law were detained that same morning, awaiting an interrogation, while the civil guard searched the house. At the same time as the raid was taking place, Nusa's other 2 sons, Mauricio and Ricardo, arrived at the house, along with Miguel Ricard, a friend of theirs. Like the rest of the family, Mauricio, Ricardo, and their friend were taken to the Patray barracks, where they were interrogated. An important thing is that Miguel Ricard voluntarily went to the barracks and gave his statement also of his own accord. In reality, his interrogation yielded the least amount of information. His story was full of contradictions, and even when he finished declaring, he seemed to feel guilty for something he hadn't done. The civil guard got the impression that Miguel, who was also Antonio's best friend, had something to do with the homicides. And while they focused on questioning the family, he was not released. Thanks to these interviews, the interrogators were able to determine that the steering wheel found near the pit did not belong to Enrique but to his older brother, Antonio, who had gone to the hospital for treatment, impersonating his younger brother. This theory was proven when, upon asking the doctor who had treated him and showing him the photos of the brothers, he recognized Antonio and not Enrique, who was thus set free. The suspect had become his older brother. Antonio seemed to have vanished. His family had not seen him for several days, which generated a lot of suspicion. Increasingly convinced that Antonio had something to do with all of this, the civil guard made his photograph public, hoping for people's help, and it did not take long to arrive. But before receiving the first hint of Antonio's whereabouts, in the early morning of January 28th, Miguel Ricard, the other suspect who was still under arrest, was interrogated again. And this time he confessed his involvement in the crimes. He said that he and his best friend Antonio, whom he had previously described as aggressive and violent, had kidnapped the girls, using a blue seat Ronda car and not a white one, as some witnesses had said. Once the girls got into the vehicle, they invited them to have a drink, and they accepted. They had told them where they were going, but they didn't protest when they passed color and continued on their way. According to Miguel, up until that point, neither he nor his friend had had to exercise. any kind of violence on the girls, who seemed to be happy with their presence. After a while of traveling, upon arriving at an open field in the La Romana area, Miguel claimed to have had relations with Desiree, while Antonio took Miriam away. After about 20 minutes, he and Desiree heard 3 shots. Angles returned and repeated the process with Desiree and Tony, to the bewilderment of Miguel, who followed his friend's orders and accompanied him in the car to a booth in La Romana, from where they took a carpet and returned to wrap the 3 bodies and load them into the trunk of the car to return to the booth area where they buried them. Hours after this statement, and with the confirmation that Antonio Angles was guilty of the murder of the 3 girls, the Civil Guard received a first sighting alert on Friday, January 29. The owners of a hair salon in Valencia contacted the police to let them know that they had served him. The man had come in to change his hair color, removing the blonde color he had done before. While that day, a not small group of officers was trying to find Antonio, Miguel expanded on the statement he had made before. In this second confession, the man clarified several of the inconsistencies he had the first time. For example, he gave the time when the events occurred. According to his version, he and Antonio had left the Angles house around 8 on Friday the 13th and headed to Picasso. This time, he admitted that they had indeed used his car, a white Opel Corsa, quite small, which matched the statements of the lady who had seen the girls get into it. He admitted that one of the girls objected when they drove past the nightclub without stopping. To calm them down, they deceived them by saying that they would go to pick up some things at his house before returning. This statement was again modified by Miguel, 23 years old, on March 2nd when he testified in front of the Alcira court. There he gave a more complete version of the events, where for the first time he admits that they sexually abused the girls. According to what he told, the first to abuse them was Antonio, who forced him to help holding the victim's legs while his friend assaulted them. When Antonio finished, he forced him to abuse Desiree. When they finished, they left the girls tied up still alive and went to buy dinner at a bar in Catadao. After eating, they returned to continue abusing them. All of this happened, according to Miguel, in the booth at La Romana, where they spent the night. The next morning, Engle made the pit with the plan to end the lives of the 3 girls. When he was satisfied with the hole, he led them to this place. Miguel wasn't sure which one, but he hit one and threw her into the pit. When the other 2 started screaming, he stabbed one and finished off the other in a way he didn't say. When all 3 were dead, Antonio removed the body from the hole to first put the carpet and then stack the bodies there. Having done this, he began to cover the hole with dirt, while ordering Miguel to uproot shrubs and bushes to put over the well and hide that they had been digging in the place. But he regretted this statement less than a month later, on March 29, when he said he was completely unaware of the facts. Instead, he said that on the day of the girls' disappearance, he had been with his girlfriend and the English brothers at a Chinese food bar. After dinner, he and his friends went out for drinks in Valencia and Catarroya, staying overnight at the house of one of his friends named Anton Partera Zafra, so he could not have participated in the crimes. And if this seems strange to you, don't worry, because a few months later, in September of that same year, Miguel changed his statement again. He admitted to being involved in the homicides and also claimed that 2 other people had participated. Mauricio Angles, one of Antonio's brothers, and a certain Nano, whose full name he said he did not know. In the version he tells, on September 3rd, in front of the same court, he claimed that all 4 of them were in his car when they picked up the girls. Regarding his involvement, he said that he collaborated and helped to move their bodies from the booth to the pit that he and the Angles brothers had dug. However, he denied having any involvement in their deaths, although he did say he witnessed one of them being murdered. In this new version, in addition to involving 2 new people, he gave also new information. He said that the mother of the English, Neuza Martins, knew the facts and had helped to flee to her eldest son, giving him 2 million pesetas to flee to Brazil. But this wasn't even the last statement. Are we going, 5, 6? On September 30th, he declared for what would be the 6th time, ratifying his last testimony and clarifying certain points. He confirmed that the events had happened in the booth at La Romana. He said that he had stayed in the car while the other 3 sexually assaulted the girls for about an hour before hearing 3 gunshots. What would have happened in the open air near where they later dug the grave? Probably at this point you are as confused as the police were at that time, who had to take the trouble to recreate the events several times without knowing for sure if things had really happened that way. As Miguel said, he changed his version so much, but so much. And he changed the details so much that it was impossible to know if anything he had said was true, if even a tiny part of what he said was true. Despite this, they came to do what they believed. It was the most faithful reconstruction of the events, supported not only by Miguel's statements, but also by the results of several autopsies, the first of which was done on January 28th. As soon as the bodies were found, it was in charge of 6 forensic doctors, led by Fernando Verdu Pascual. A second autopsy was done at the request of the victims' relatives, and it was performed by the expert Luis Frontela. In this second autopsy, a DNA study of 15 hairs that had been found on the girls' bodies was conducted. Upon analysis, it was concluded that they did not belong to them, nor to Ancoles or Miguel. In fact, it was concluded that they could belong to between 5 and 7 different people. This supported the theory that more people were involved in the crime, people who were not among the suspects. Additionally, an analysis of the larvae found on the bodies was conducted during these autopsies. Although Frontela could only do this through photos and videos taken during the first autopsy. The expert concluded that the size of the insects did not correspond with the state of decay of the bodies. Therefore, he suggested that the victims had been buried in 2 different places. With all this information, the Civil Guard managed to reconstruct the events in the following way. On Friday the 13th of November 1992, Antonio Angles and Miguel Ricard were driving along the Picassant Road in the latter's white Opel Corsa when they noticed the group of 3 girls hitchhiking. Upon seeing them, Antonio ordered Miguel to stop the car and asked them if they were heading to Color. Offering to take them, Tony, Desiree, and Miriam accepted and got into the vehicle. When they passed their destination, the 3 nervous friends began to scream. This caused Antonio to pull out his 9mm Star pistol and hit them with the butt of it. He then tied them up. Under the order of his friend Miguel, he drove his car to Catadao, an area that Angeles always used to hide from the Civil Guard when they were looking for him. Thanks to that, he had discovered the famous ruined hut in Rome, which Miguel had referred to in his statement. Inside that place, they abused Desiree and Miriam before tying them up again to go back to the village to get dinner. After eating, they abused Antonia. When they finished, still in the night, they dug the grave and forced the girls to walk there, where they shot them in the head and hid their bodies before burying them. Finally, they picked up the shell casings and cleaned the car before leaving. This version of events is what they used to conduct the trial. The trial against Miguel Ricard began on May 12, 1997, and it consisted of 49 sessions that were held until July 30th of that year. As expected, it was a trial highly publicized, followed by both national and international press. During 1994 and 1996, the trial had been delayed 3 times due to the emergence of potential new leads that forced the case to be reopened on Friday, May 9, 1997. A few days before the start of the trial, expert Luis Frontela delivered a new report documenting possible blood, semen, and other organic fluid stains that had been found on the carpet in which the bodies of the 3 girls were wrapped. These new findings had been discovered thanks to a new technique used by the expert, who had recently obtained the necessary equipment to carry them out. This new report was not accepted, and despite the demand for the trial to be suspended so that the new evidence could be analyzed. This did not happen, and it divided the families of the victims. Given that the lawyers for the families of Miriam and Tony were outraged that the trial was still being held, days after such important new evidence appeared. And Desiree's family agreeing that the trial should start once and for all. A demonstration of 1,500 people in Alcácer showed their support, with the families of Antonia and Miriam demanding the postponement of the trial, but this also did not change the agreed date. The trial began on May 12th without considering the expert's report as evidence. The process began with the interrogations of the accused, first being questioned by the prosecutor and later by the family's lawyers. In the hearings of the following weeks, various witnesses were called to testify. Among those were Antonio Angles's mother, his siblings, Miguel Ricard's ex-girlfriend, his Zelda partner, and also the couple who had taken the girls from Alcácer to Picason. The declaration hearings ended on May 30th, and since then, on June 16th, they began with the presentation of psychological and forensic reports. During those hearings, Luis Frontela argued that the first autopsy had presented several irregularities on the part of the forensic doctors. He directly accused them of having caused the loss of evidence that could have been key in identifying the murderers. At the same time, the Valencian forensic doctors opposed the conclusions that expert Frontela had reached in the second autopsy. They said that the study of the larvae was not reliable. In addition, they explained that there was not enough evidence to affirm that the girls had been buried in different places. According to them, the bodies lacked key signs that usually remain in such a situation. After months of deliberation, on September 5, 1997, the Provincial Court of Valencia sentenced Ricard to a penalty of 70 years in prison for 3 counts of homicide, 3 counts of kidnapping, and 4 continuous counts of rape. In its ruling, the court concluded that Antonio Angles had been the main culprit of the triple homicide. But they still didn't know where he was. Surprisingly, Miguel was only in prison for 21 years. On November 29, 2013, he regained his freedom thanks to a change in Spain's criminal laws. If you have any doubts, don't worry, you're not the only ones. This case is full of unknowns that, far from being resolved, have only increased. In the last 30 years, when more information has come to light, in 2017, for example, Professor Francisco Echeverria found a badly damaged dental piece in the area where the bodies were found, from which genetic information could not be extracted. But many people thought it could be from one of the girls. 2 years later, in June 2019, a couple hiking in that same area found a few human bones that belonged to the victims. In October 2021, the case's presiding judge ordered them to be analyzed. 50 hairs found on the bodies of the 3 young women and a mattress that had been found in the La Romana hut. These elements had not been analyzed at the time of the crime because the necessary advancements did not exist to do so. In June of 2022, that same court ordered new DNA analyses on the girls' underwear and other remains found at the crime scene, including the carpet. Something important to clarify is that the case was never officially closed. The authorities continue to search for Antonio Angles, but the case will expire in 2029. So the Fugitive Location Unit of the National Police is hoping more than ever to be able to find him before that date so he can face a trial for his crimes. The case remains highly relevant in Spanish society. And that's why every so often a new documentary or book emerges that seeks to provide answers to all the unknowns of this case. The reality is that the case has so many doubts, and there are so many loose ends that many Spaniards have a lot of doubts about the official version. There are documentary rumors in which a lot is said about the lies of the case or what would be the lack of truths. In reality, there are more doubts than certainties in all of these. So around all these years, there has been a lot of talk about all these shortcomings. In principle, it's hard to agree with this if the research was poorly done from day one in. Fernando Garcia, Miriam's father, played a prominent role in the search for the girls from Alcácer, whose bodies were eventually found. He became convinced that the crime was not as simple as 2 men wanting to rape them, by how, when, and where they were found. He came to the conclusion that there were powerful people behind the case, that someone had the means to hide what really happened. It's also necessary to understand everything in a more complete context, knowing that the case was used by the media and exploited to the fullest. Obviously, I'm not going to play the saint here, we are talking about them. But I think this is one of the few cases where suddenly so many cameras were put into the family's homes when they were just receiving the news of the findings, live and direct. It was a very media-driven story. Every second of those families' suffering was televised. Of course, this also means that they were not allowed to grieve properly. When it was known that the young women had died, they took the families from program to program. And of course, that implies that there was a lot of interest in knowing what was happening. So, the poor investigation of the case, along with the striking nature of this story and the number of people waiting for a resolution, made it much easier to publicize theories that deviated from the official version. Fernando was never satisfied with what justice dictated and took advantage of all the interest to make known what he thought. At first, he received all the support from people who wanted justice, but over the years, the public grew tired. And to this day, there are those who consider him tedious or that he ended up exaggerating in his search for the truth. However, there are others who really think that there was a conspiracy that happened here. Something we will never be able to understand, because there are many accomplices with money and connections who took care of hiding it and creating another story. Let's be honest, the amount of contradictions, unknowns is not normal. Getting to the point, there are elements that make us doubt that these two individuals are the culprits of the case. Starting with the timelines in which they managed to commit the crime and hide the bodies. Let's start with the car, that small car in which they supposedly took the girls. This one had to travel an hour to get to where they left them buried, which usually on a more or less decent route would have no problems. The problem starts when that little car has to go on the dirt road, which is between gravel and mud. Difficult even for a 4x4. I'm going to be honest with you, on vacation a few years ago, I took a 4x4 route with a Volkswagen app. It's not that it's impossible, but it does make the journey much slower and much more difficult for the vehicle, which should have been left with some trace of that road. Let's add that if all this started around 8 at night, it becomes even more difficult to go to a place like that with so little light. But again, it's not impossible. They wouldn't be the first or the last killers to do these things at night and in remote places. Let's assume this is all possible. What then about Angles's escape? How can someone disappear absolutely so quickly? Since the whereabouts of the bodies were known, the existence of two suspects was also known. Personally, I consider it was a colossal mistake to rush to the television while interviewing the families to say that they already had someone in their sights. While this is information that can potentially alleviate the terrible pain of the families, it is also a warning to the guilty parties. If it's true that Angles was still alive, then he would already be alert and with a plan ready to escape. Despite this, it is assumed that they went to look for him, and there he fled across Spain extremely quickly and no one was ever able to catch him. The fact that they had hardly any clues about his whereabouts even made them doubt the witnesses who saw him. Let's also tell the truth about the Social Security flyer in the name of Enrique K. Angles. Was this paper there for 2.5 months? That is, there were several things thrown around the place. It's not that only this flyer was there, but anyway, all these objects remained there all that time. And obviously it's possible that it remained there, trapped among the undergrowth. But is it right to leave a paper where a person can be identified? And why would he even bring it to the scene? Maybe Angles was very foolish and thought it would be a good idea to frame his brother. But I think no one could believe it's a great plan to lead the police to a relative. The reality is that, as far as we know, there are no forensic evidence or clues linking Angles to the crime. Don't you want to return to your country? If there's no evidence, why doesn't he come out of hiding? This is exactly where the theory that Angles is already dead comes from, that he was always dead, that he didn't run away. Or maybe he ran away and was quickly caught, but no one wants to admit it. Questions naturally arise due to the time passed since his disappearance and the discovery of blood traces. The booth in La Romana, where they supposedly killed the girls, had no traces of blood, fluids, or signs of a fight. Clearly, they could have cleaned it up, but the truth is, they don't seem like people who would plan everything with such precision, nor do they have experience killing. Unless the detectives missed several details. We still need to know what happened with the new DNA tests that were ordered. In addition to finding other people's pubic hairs on the bodies, it was determined that they would be from 5 or 7 different individuals. Perhaps with more recent technology, better discoveries can be made. During the second autopsy, for example, a Caravaca cross was found embedded in Desiree's spine. What is this over here? Which wouldn't be strange, considering that the bodies were very decomposed by then. Some things could have gotten mixed up, right? But that cross didn't belong to any of them. So the question isn't precisely how the cross got there, to the skeleton, but rather where did it come from? And what if we're talking about a botched autopsy, like the first one, in which somehow that cross wasn't found? We can also talk about how, before taking the photo of the objects found in the pit, they moved them together, obviously touching them and disrupting the scene. It also seems that the photographic rolls were quite expensive, because they only took one photo of the bodies inside the pit, which I could easily put on YouTube because you can't see anything. That is, that photo barely serves as an anecdote. And then the rest of the photos, it seems like they were saving throughout the whole case because there are very few. When collecting the bodies, this was done so poorly that a lot of incriminating evidence may have been lost in the process. And before starting with the analyses, someone went and washed the bodies. I don't know if you realize how terrible this is, because if they initially mishandled the bodies, imagine what evidence was lost by washing them. With this, I suppose you can imagine everything they did. Between not taking photos, making sketches, or properly examining the bodies. Well, there are countless things. But the incompetence didn't just come from the forensic team, but also from the detectives and all the police involved in the case. The statements and reconstruction of the events were carried out very poorly. The case is so inconsistent that certain individuals were forced to compile all the documents that exist about this crime, as they did on this blog about the Alcácer crime, which has a lot of useful information if you want to check it out. And on the other hand, we also have people like Juan Ignacio Blanco, the journalist who helped Fernando Garcia throughout the investigation. Well, he said he had this tape in which they were being hurt, but he didn't give a lot of details. The only thing that is clear is that Blanco claimed that this was a snuff film that had been the whole purpose of the crime, to make a movie where they were killed. Blanco said he had handed the tape over to the police, and various media outlets asked him multiple times to see that tape, which he never complied with. Many doubt that it is real, but he spoke convincingly that such a film existed. There are things within this theory that powerful people killed them, which seem like conspiracy theory to me. And as usual, I also think that there are many facts that we cannot verify 100% that were taken by conspiracy theorists as absolute truths, which only feed the poor investigation that was done from the beginning. I think that in reality, we don't need any outrageous information to understand that definitely something else happened. Either there is another involved party that was never mentioned again, or Angles was always dead, or it could be that people who had connections were to blame for all of this. Right here in my country, there are cases like this, but even when it comes to people with power, some name or another comes to light. Some people prefer not to believe in any theory, and they say that Angles was already a criminal, that he had already had violent behaviors, and that there really is no excuse for him. So much so that it was surely him, and that he escaped perfectly, or that he is already dead. In Spain, there is a lot of talk that Angles and Ricard, or at least Angles, is a scapegoat. The equivalent here would be a fall guy, someone who was put in place to take responsibility for the events to exonerate the real culprits. In 2022, Ricard was arrested after being found in an apartment with multiple drugs. He was later released. Let's say he hasn't been involved in violent crimes himself. After this, so what is the truth? While the official version may be true in the sense that these two people may have been guilty, it lacks many things. But then, the theory that it wasn't them, or that people with a lot of money and many connections, a lot of power, made them participate. Whatever happened, it also has many holes. There are many things we don't know, largely because it wasn't investigated as it should have been. And precisely because of that, we may never really know what happened. Before finishing talking about this topic, I have to mention that there is a case known as Bar Spain, which has been talked about a lot. They say it is connected to the Alcácer case, but the topic is... it's too long to cover in this video. So tell me if you want to see it on the channel and we'll do it. Well, in the end, I don't know if I'm happy with this video. I don't know if I'm gonna like how it turns out. We'll see. Once it's rendered and you can see it, I tried my best. The truth is that I'm always going to miss some detail here and there, surely. But you also have to keep in mind that there are many things that in these cases are rumors. What I mean is that while there are testimonies, there are expert opinions and everything else. There are always things that people said that other people believed and that were spread as truths. This happens in all cases, therefore it's difficult to differentiate well what to believe. Because although we have, for example, autopsies, there are people who don't believe they are done correctly. So there's that too. There is no conclusion. That's the conclusion. Would you leave in the comments what you think about all this? What do you believe and what do you not believe? And well, keep watching to see if in some way or another it gets resolved. So we've come to the end of this video. Here are the Patreons and channel members. Thank you for supporting me through those means. With nothing left to say, here's a new video and a recommended one. You can subscribe by clicking on my face and see you in another video. Goodbye.